So next up we have the Data tab. These controls in the Data tab are designed to help you display large amounts of data to the user. So for example, the Grid View control displays data in a table, and it's quite easy to use. We'll have a look at that a bit later in this series. Data List, as its name suggests, displays data in a list. Details View displays information for a single record. So typically what you'd have, a data grid, a grid view, to display a set of records, and then when the user clicks on or double clicks on one of those records, you'd switch to another page, and that page would contain a details view to display all the details for the record the user's actually selected. Okay, Form View. The Form View control displays the values for a data record, and it enables you to use user-defined templates, so you can specify quite specifically how you want all the various bits of information to be laid out. And likewise, we have the Repeater control. The Repeater is a container, and it lets you create custom lists on a web page. So we're going to have a look at these various different ways of displaying data coming up later on in the series. But you can see, as well as the visible controls, we have a selection of non-visible controls called data sources. So first of all, we have SQL data source. SQL data source lets you bind a web page to a relational database, such as SQL Server, or Oracle, or DB2, or whatever. It encapsulates the data returned from a query on that database. If you're trying to get data from a Microsoft Access database, then you'll want to use one of these. The Access data source represents data from Microsoft Access. Okay, then we have the Object data source. Object data source lets you bind a web control to a custom class that you write yourself in a web application. This is quite a realistic requirement. Often, rather than binding data controls directly to a database, what you'll want to do is to write some code in a middle tier, and the code will have various methods, and each of those methods, for example, might invoke a store procedure. What you can do is you can bind your visible data controls to one of those methods, such that the method will be executed, it'll return a set of data, and that data will be bound to a web page and displayed to the user. So we'll see how to do that later as well. Okay, next up, XML data source. Well, XML data source lets you bind to XML data, as you probably guessed. This is useful if you want to create hierarchical menus on the web page, for example. Okay, and then up we have sitemap data source. Sitemap data source represents data for a sitemap. The sitemap lets users navigate around the various pages in the website. And then finally, we have report viewer. Report viewer lets you view reports from SQL Server reporting services. We won't be covering Report Viewer in this series. Okay, so let's close the Data tab and take a quick look at some of the others.